just applied the Sweet Baby Rays. Sweet Baby Rays. Sweet Baby Rays. Maybe throw some Sweet Baby Rays on the ribs and take it from there. She's waiting for her ribs. I mean, she knows what's coming, and a Sweet Baby Rays. So that's pretty good. Yeah. Who doesn't like ribs? Everyone likes ribs. Everyone likes ribs.
Excuse me.
Yeah, no, this is what Facebook Live is for. Just hanging out while you're sitting in your backyard, waiting for your brisket and your ribs to finish smoking.
Are you guys ready? Check this out. This is, oh yeah, wow. Look at that. Pretty good. We're looking pretty good on the brisket. I just lost. Bye guys.
$10,000? $10,000 bet? $10,000 bet? $10,000 bet? $10,000? $10,000 bet? $10,000? $10,000 bet? $10,000? $10,000 bet?
It is very, very disturbing when I hear the millionaire or billionaire word. And I've told them to stop it, knock it off. It is very, very disturbing when I hear the millionaire or billionaire word. And I told them to stop it, knock it off.
Cross our hearts and hope to die. We believe in all these things, but we do not like the way warn you, and let me warn the nation against the smooth evasion that says, of course we believe these things. We believe in social security. We believe in work for the unemployed. We believe in saving homes. Cross our hearts and hope to die. We believe in all these things, but we do not like the way the present administration is doing them. Just turn them over to us. We will do all of them. We will do more of them. We will do them better, and most important of all, the doing of them will not cost anybody anything.
Infrastructure, no bumps in the road.
Almost a month ago, the Commission of Inquiry, which was formed by the UN Human Rights Council, concluded its report, and they said in a clear-cut, in unequivocal way, Palestinians do have the right of freedom of expression. Palestinians do have the right to have their demonstrations. Nobody have the right to tell them where to do it, whether in the border or in Gaza. These demonstrations for 1 full year in 5 designated areas provided for these peaceful demonstrations were entirely peaceful, and no evidence whatsoever after full thorough investigation by the Commission of Inquiry showed that there was any level of violence has been practiced. Not a single Israeli soldier life has been threatened, and no Israeli soldier was injured or killed in these 5 designated areas where peaceful demonstration took place. But the Commission of Inquiry and all human rights organizations, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty, FIDH, Euromed, Human Rights Network, Palestinian Israeli, that the Israeli did war crimes, crimes against humanity by snipers who saw surely the bodies, faces, the signs of the children they killed, of the women they killed, of the nurses, of the handicapped, of the old and young people who were demonstrating hundreds of meters away from these Israeli soldiers where they didn't pose any sort of threat. So Israel wanted this. Israel wanted to kill and shoot it. Children, nurses, women, the civilians who demonstrated for 1 year almost to say one thing: we cannot tolerate this.
Welcome to the Michael Brooks Show. We're broadcasting live from downtown Brooklyn, USA, where we shout every week Lula Livre with super producer Matt Leck.
Hello.
Chief economist and, wait for it, David Griscom. Go ahead.
How's it going?
Welcome to everybody in the TMBS extended universe, to the whole TMBS team that makes every step of this show possible. On this week's program, the great Anna Kasparian returns. We're talking about the case for impeachment. Why even in a complex world best described by Marxism, holding the rampant and grotesque and obscene criminal Trump organization accountable actually matters, even if establishment whack Democrats won't do it properly. We're also talking about why we need single payer, what actual socialized medicine means, and why the constant Elizabeth Warren waffling and equivocating is a very bad sign for those that care about every human being being insured. And then, what does housing for all mean? Why rent control works in Bernie Sanders' plan? And that's from Anna, who is, in addition to being a housing expert, has actually some critiques of rent control on a local implementation, but understands why it's needed at a federal level like Sanders is proposing. Then we have a gem. We're talking about the rural hospital crisis, a shout out, medicine for all. The UK Labour Party has a strategy to make pharmaceuticals a global commons. This is a major global equity issue. The corrupt Lavajato team offered the world's most prominent political prisoner, Lula da Silva, house release for quote-unquote good behavior. He's refusing. He will not leave without pure vindication. The chutzpah of that great president. Haiti is uprising. We're talking about the trend from the Hugo Chavez Act of Solidarity through Washington's pressure on Haiti, through the Clinton State Department, the Trump administration, the protests that are happening now, a brief intro to world systems theory. The Prime Minister of Barbados speaks for a multipolar world and against U.S. regime change efforts in Venezuela, and why The relentless, grotesque media bias against Bernie Sanders matters beyond the campaign because it shows the very structural bias against all of the American working class. All that plus a throwback bad third way. And in the debunk section, Ben Burgess and I discuss our new article, How Bernie Can Answer the Disingenuous Venezuela Question. All that on the post game and all of that on this week's Michael Brooks Show. But first, let's start by going to Israel Palestine, where unity government talks have faltered after Netanyahu's main rival, General Gantz, has rejected a meeting. Benny Gantz. I'll quote briefly from Reuters. Talks to form a national unity government in Israel hit a further snag on Tuesday after Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's centrist election rival called off a meeting with the embattled leader. And I have some big questions about whether, defining Benny Gantz, a general responsible for very extensive and systemic war crimes in Gaza, a centrist, is both a media failure on Reuters' part and, in fact, an unwitting damning indictment of the ongoing occupation and the politics of Israel and Palestine. As these talks falter, it's important to get an understanding of a consensus inside Israel, which sees as a matter of ongoing reality and normalcy that Israel is going to govern 5 million people that have no democratic rights. They don't have freedom of movement. They don't vote in elections. They are, in fact, run in literally operationally and in terms of reality systems that would look to be analogous to the Jim Crow South. There's separate roads in the occupied territories for Palestinians and Israelis. There's a broad, extensive apartheid structure. And that is not going to be challenged by the blue and white alliance of Benny Gantz. The center-right that Benny Gantz represents is challenging Benjamin Netanyahu's Likud because Benjamin Netanyahu has extensive and serious accusations of personal corruption around him, and not only personal corruption in a venile sense, which many Israeli leaders have both been charged with and actually served jail time in the case of Ehud Olmert, but in Netanyahu's case, actual corruption that has a bearing on the free press and democratic function of Israel within 67 borders. And that is an escalation in the overall authoritarian turn of Israel, even outside of the over 40-year occupation of Palestine and, of course, the 47 making of the Israeli state, which, of course, there is a profound historical justification and understanding of why people would want that, but also was literally predicated on cleansing Palestinians out of their homes. This is historical reality and undeniable. That's one part of what's happening. The other part is that there are multiple factions at play here, and just as in any other part of the world, it's helpful to have a real broader guide post for understanding all of the various people and factions and interests that you're talking about. So we've talked about Likud, and I will just touch a little bit more on Benny Gantz and the Blue and White Alliance. Benny Gantz is a former IDF general. In 2014, he led the assault against Gaza, which the UN says at least 2,104 Palestinians died, including 1,462 civilians, 495 were children, 253 were women. Now, the prime argument of the Blue and White list is to, as I said, a Blue and White Alliance is to retrieve some sense of normalcy in Israel, and because of the personal, just utterly out of control, nation brand damaging conduct, behavior, and way of Netanyahu. And the Joint List, which I'm going to get to in a minute, the Joint List is a very important party in Israel. They're the third highest vote getter, and they are a coalition of socialists and those who represent Arab civil rights. This is significant, and you should go and look up. I did a standalone primer on the Joint List and democracy in the Middle East, which is available on this same YouTube channel in one of the Monday streams. The Joint List is the only vehicle for pure democracy in Israel and Palestine that's electoral. They got 13 votes, and they were willing to support Gantz getting into government because of a desire to get rid of Netanyahu, and Gantz has been standoffish, to say the least. There's also been problems inside the joint list, with some objecting to going into coalition with Gantz because of his war crimes in Gaza. But let's talk a bit more about the joint list. They're made up of 4 Palestinian parties: Balad, Hadash, Talal, and the United Arab List. Of these 4, the socialist Hadash won the majority of seats for the ticket. And this is where the leader, Ayman Odeh, comes from. If there is a unity government between Likud and Blue and White, the joint list would be the largest party in opposition, meaning that the leader of Hadash in the joint list, Ayman Odeh, would receive military briefings, and the joint list would have representatives in important committees that make decisions regarding Palestine. This could be hugely significant. There's likely going to be an attempt to thwart it as the reality of Israeli racism and anti-democracy gets further and further articulated. On the right, there's Israel Betenenu, which is a far-right pro-settler group run by Avdor Lieberman, who is a secular fascist and extremely opposed to Shas, which is an ultra-Orthodox party. There's 2 ultra-Orthodox parties, actually. Shas tends to be obviously extremely socially conservative, but support more generous social benefits. The other ultra-Orthodox party is in fact highly market-oriented and is more like the far right in the United States in that sense. Meretz is a traditionally outspoken critic of the treatment of Palestinians and really the only party left of sort of social democracy in Israel. It joined the Democratic Union, where it appears they have turned their back on both their principles, and they've and also was strategically ineffective. This was the alliance formed by the former Prime Minister Ehud Barak, who's mostly been known in recent months for his associations with Jeffrey Epstein. Now, the Labor Party still exists. They just barely managed to survive, and under Amir Peretz, who is a Moroccan labor union organizer who's also implicated as defense secretary in the Olmert government in war crimes in Lebanon, but does have a genuine anti-austerity labor politics. He tried to basically make labor not talk about the peace process and external relations or Palestinians in general, but focus back on retrieving Israeli social democracy. And labor, which has been utterly decimated, was in fact able to at least survive in parliament with that approach. Now, inside Palestine, you have 3 kind of broad factions. There's the president of the Palestinian Authority, Mahmoud Abbas, who announced elections will be held in the near future. There haven't been elections since 2006, in large part because Fatah and Hamas have struggled to come to an agreement on a variety of issues. Fatah controls the West Bank. They are profoundly moderate. They're security subcontractors of Israel. If you are a believer in the two-state solution and the peace process, which is a dead, discredited process, this is the only faction you can have any trust and belief in. They actually will go to the mat for this. You also have a BDS movement, which arises out of civil society efforts in Palestine. They're exhausted by other forms of struggle. The BDS movement hopes to draw attention to the plight of Palestinians while breaking the economic incentives that support the settlement system. The movements and its co-founders are regularly threatened and harassed, and recently have been denied entry to the United States. Then, of course, you have Hamas running Gaza. Hamas is a right-wing organization connected to the Muslim Brotherhood. It has fused religious conservatism, social welfare programs, and engaged extensively before elections when it came to power in the Bush administration in terrorism. There's no doubt about it. And we need to be able to condemn, blowing up a pizza parlor and targeting civilians. You need to be able to condemn that, period. You can't condemn violence, period, of a liberation struggle. That would be profoundly presumptuous and arrogant. But something that specifically targets civilians in that manner, we have to have some basic standards here. Hamas in government is trying to govern and trying to survive. And whatever we think of them, and of course we oppose them in many respects because of our politics, the reality is that there is a pure asymmetry in this situation. Israel controls both Palestinian territories, has a totalized control over the system, and has in fact inflicted significant damage and many crimes and many killings on Gaza. And the justification of Hamas is simply absurd given the profound asymmetry of the situation. In the 2018, the nation-state law was passed, which codified second-class citizenship for Arabs inside 67 borders, declaring Israel the natural home of the Jewish people and the right to exercise national determination in the state of Israel as quote-unquote unique to the Jewish people. Netanyahu has also signed a pledge to annex the Jordan Valley as the reality of what that political system gets clearer and clearer every day. Despite Netanyahu's corruption scandals and personal failures, he's been successful at pulling the country even farther to the right. The difference between Gantz and Netanyahu is the difference between degree of suffering the Palestinians will face under this apartheid system. There's hope from the growth of the Joint List and the international solidarity movements to end the apartheid system, but there's much work to be done. Folks, be real about that issue. Does anybody else have anything you want to offer?
It's been very encouraging to see the growth, obviously, of the Joint List, and specifically the more left socialist aspect of that movement through Hadash. And it's obviously very unclear what's going to happen over the next few weeks. Israeli politics is certainly in crisis, but you hope out of crisis comes some kind of opportunity for an end to this. Though it's very frightening when you see the two main oppositions being very similar in their treatment of Palestinians.
Absolutely.
I hate to almost bring this up because it's Ben Rhodes, but Ben Rhodes tweeted out in the last couple of months that the rise of fascism worldwide isn't inevitable, and it is kind of encouraging to see all of these different places. They kind of with Brazil or Britain, also that they sort of get within the red zone, to use a football metaphor, but they can't punch it into the end zone at least. So
we'll see. Israel's a forerunner of this stuff, but definitely there's a lot. It's significant. And with the Joint List.
Just one quick point,
just
ahead. Domestically for people who are listening in the United States and the UK, it's really important that we continue to put our pressure on this issue, as the United States plays a large role in Israel, and also in preventing people from being able to come to the United States or the UK. That comes from our government. That we really need to be pressuring the people in power who are trying to also maintain this system.
Absolutely. Let's get to the shout out and let's play Danarchy's shout out, shall we? I want to try
some classic.
Let's get to
it's a classic.
Shout out, creepy. Shout out, weird. I
think that's
creepy.
It's incredible.
Shout out.
It's incredible.
Crazy. Shout out. This is out of control. Shout out. That's creepy. Shout out. That's weird. Creepy. Weird. Crazy. This is crazy. This is out of control. This is weird. Shout out.
I realize I actually don't have this paper in front of me, which I needed. Can we scroll down here? This is a piece called Medicines for the Many. The UK, in the UK and across the world, Big Pharma is ripping off public health systems and denying patents on vital medicines. This week, the Labour Party offered an alternative. Just scroll down a bit. Basically, right here. Across the range, right there is good. You got it. Insufficient investment. That's what I want. I'll get to it in a second. So, that's it. So, basically, we know that in developed systems, there's patents on drugs. There's private drug companies which charge astronomical fees for life-saving care. That's a huge problem across the globe. We also know that this applies to developing countries as well, and both in terms of access to medications like cancer medications, but also in terms of disincentivizing even the development of drugs that could treat diseases that, frankly, there isn't a high profit margin on. So this is a really important area. And I have to say, once again, UK viewers, your Labour Party is delivering another incredible policy innovation here. I'm going to quote from Medicines for the Many in the Jacobin. There's also an insufficient investment into conditions that affect people living in the global south. Again, because these markets are considered not lucrative enough Pharmaceutical companies spend more on marketing and buying back their own shares than they do in research and development. All this points to a system that does not recognize health as a human right. Scroll down a bit. A package of measures contained in Medicine for the Many couldn't have come sooner. The proposals include a willingness to use compulsory licensing, a legal mechanism that allows the government to override patent and other permits. Companies to produce medicine at lower prices for the benefit of the public good. The World Trade Organization, the World Health Organization recognize that intellectual property rights are not absolute and actively supports governments to use their right to address the public health needs. A compulsory license on Orcacambi could break the current deadlock and allow Luis and patients to access their crucial treatment. That goes back to an earlier case study they talked about somebody who's not getting getting essential care because they don't have access for their to the drug for treatment. And that's just for starters. The public sector will also play a significant role in funding research and development. Some estimates say that between 2/3 of upfront health research globally is funded by the public purse. Scroll down a bit. But there are no safeguards in this system to ensure medicines developed with public money will benefit the public. And it starts to go on to talk about ensuring the public benefit. And then finally, labor will support public democratic ownership of drug development. Guys, the UK Labour Party, housing, healthcare, medicine, worker cooperatives, forefront of democracy in the 21st century. Friends don't let friends vote Lib Dem. Get serious. Organize for the UK Labour Party. All right, let's talk pitch. Maybe get a little instrumental. So, folks, it's the first of the month. This is when, and we had a very strong month last month. We got within 200 of our 3,000 patron goal, which is our next goal that we need to get to quickly. So I'd like to get to 3,000 patrons by the end of October. Let's make this happen. What happens at the first of the month is there's always a few people who drop off. So either, look, if you've been a long-time patron and you have a financial change, let us know and we'll figure something out for you. If you've been sitting and waiting, now's the time to do it, beginning of the month. You know, someone just went to the bench, run on the field, take their place. Become a patron today. Then there's a lot of folks who, and this always happens with Patreon, you got to make sure your card is up to date. You got to make sure that your payment systems are in place. Sometimes it can be a little bit finicky and annoying, but they will take care of you if you make sure that all is good. And then you're all set to go and keep getting all that great content that you rely on. Become a patron today, patreon.com/TMBS. Get 2-to-1 extra content, including upcoming conversations on historical ruptures and Bernie Sanders with Harvey K., the history of counter-hegemonic institutions with Daniel Bessner, the backlog of histories from everything from Kurdistan to Jamaica, theory introductions, and, of course, the huge amount of fun we have on the post-game. I mean, you could be sitting in the studio, basically, cracking up while we have a fun time with one of our great in-studio guests. So folks like Artesio Balthrop or Anna Kasparian or Emma Vigeland or Milton Alamati or Richard Wolf. It's time, guys. Patreon.com/TMBS. Sign up today. You can hit us if you want during the stream with a super chat donation. Everything helps. I've started to offer more things on the YouTube. I'm doing mini idea primers on Monday. They're not nearly as fleshed out as the Sunday episodes, but they'll give you a nice little nugget of something. One was on the joint list in Israel. The one I did yesterday was on Mark Fisher's Capitalist Realism. That's a really important book. Upcoming ones on the Vampire Castle and on anti-essentialism with the great Adolf Reed, who hopefully we'll have on as a guest again soon. And then a news roundup Thursday or Friday. And I take your questions and stuff like that. I think we'll probably get to 79,000 subs tonight on YouTube. We want to hit that 100,000. But, of course, patreon.com/TMBS. Then, come see us in Philly. Griscom, you want to pitch the Philly show?
We're pretty stacked
We are
for
stacked.
Philly. We got Emma Vigeland, Crystal Ball, and Artesia. It's going to be a really good time. All these live shows really have been so wonderful, and each one is so different. So if you've already been to one, like really,
come.
You don't want to miss it again. Before the show, for VIP folks, we're going to be hanging out, get to know everybody. It's really nice to be able to meet all these people and put a face to a lot of the names that we see online.
Put a face to names and put a beer to our mouths. Well, Michael doesn't drink before the show, but
That's true.
But
These
I do.
guys do, though.
I do, though.
I can be tempted.
These guys definitely accept your drinks. That's usually what happens. Is it's me in a corner being like, well, I think the very interesting thing that you're asking me about Haiti is the following, and then Matt's like, let's take a picture. These guys want pictures. Let's do it. Left is best. All right. No, we go on stage. It's gonna be good. It's cool. And then Griscom's just like, hey, this guy's got cowboy boots, man.
I find a
This
football
is a
people
fucking
immediately.
amazing community we have.
I'm telling you, they're a lot of fun.
We have an amazing time. We love meeting all of you. Get your tickets today. We have a link. And of course, we should say it's November 23rd. That's the week before Thanksgiving. No scheduling problems. World Cafe, Philadelphia. We have a link on the homepage for you to buy the ticket. And during the show, David, you mind? Why don't we tweet out a link to it from the TMBS account?
Yeah, I'll put it up.
All right, folks, we're going to take a brief break. We just did this interview this afternoon with the great Anna Kasparian. She made the case for impeachment, talked about Bernie's healthcare plan, Elizabeth Warren's alarming waffling on healthcare, and making homelessness a thing of the past in the United States with Bernie Sanders' excellent Housing for All plan. Let's go to that. Joining us now on the Michael Brooks Show is returning champion, regular guest, friend, paisan, everything good. She's a co-host and executive producer on The Young Turks. She's also the host of No Filter, which is an incredibly good YouTube and podcast show, which you should be subscribing to directly. Anna Kasparian. Anna, how you doing?
Hey, I'm doing well. Thanks for having me.
Always a pleasure. Anna, why should we impeach the MFer?
Well, for me, the strongest argument and what's persuaded me that impeachment is the right way to go about this is that it's important to maintain and sustain our system of checks and balances. And when the president breaks a law and it's a significant crime, we need to ensure that Congress holds that individual accountable for his or her actions. So in this case, Donald Trump reached out to a foreign leader in an effort to get this individual to investigate and dig up dirt on his political opponent. And if the tables were turned and we had a Democrat in office, first off, I would argue that people on the left, myself included, would want the same actions by Congress. But more importantly, Republicans wouldn't just let that person off easily. Republicans would investigate the situation over and over again until they got exactly what they wanted. And so in this case, my main frustration has been just the utter weakness of the Democratic leadership. The fact that Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer, kowtow to the right wing, the fact that they're so afraid to ever hold anyone on the right accountable for their actions. Go back and look at the Obama administration and the number of investigations that congressional Republicans launched into his administration. I mean, night and day. The comparison is insane because you just really see how incredibly weak Democrats are. For me, this isn't about, I hate Trump and I want him out of office. For me, this is about the rule of law, and this is about holding someone in a position of power accountable for his actions.
Word. And I I don't know whether you're moving in and out of rooms, but just like make sure your phone is held up really clearly so people can hear you 100%. So I agree with everything you've just said, particularly on the political difference between Republicans and Democrats. What about the concern that, I did a commentary where I was really trying to thread a needle between the fact that, like, I agree with you, and I think even if you have a really radical political stance, it is incredibly naive to pretend that the institutions here do not serve like some function, including like protecting some really important things, even if they're corrupted and discredited and hypocritical and everything that we all know, right? Like, I remember when I had I had a couple of minutes to talk to Fernando Haddad, who was the person who ran in Lula's place for the Workers' Party when he was in New York a couple of months ago. And actually, things have not gone quite as bad as they could have, at least in the first year of Bolsonaro. But he was saying, like, look, like, you guys have circuit breakers going back hundreds of years in the States. We don't have that here. Like, our Constitution was in the 1980s. Like, we have much weaker institutions. So institutions definitely matter. And at the same time, I think that even just like the context around the story, right? Like, like what Trump thinks Biden did is a discredited conspiracy theory, but Joe Biden's kid getting a 50 grand board seat is real. And it is swamp, and it is dysfunction, and it is systemic corruption. So do you think there's like a little bit of like for the American public, sort of like eye roll of like, oh, okay, like here comes the smelling salts, like partially because they already know Donald Trump is Donald Trump, and also because they have a more maybe systemic cynicism about everybody in politics?
Yeah, so let me start my answer to your question by saying that this whole story makes me realize how much I can't stand the lack of nuance in a lot of the discussions that take place on various political issues. So is there corruption behind the fact that Joe Biden's son was getting paid $50,000 a month working in a position that he had no expertise in? Yeah, absolutely. There's definitely something shady there. Now, I don't know anything about criminality. I mean, there hasn't been any evidence that there was criminality, but I think that it's the perfect, this is the perfect example of how people in positions of power will use that position to their advantage to, get these lucrative deals and positions for their family members. So does that make me sick? Absolutely. But I also think that, people who lob onto that do so as a way to deflect from the fact that we have an executive branch that's just swimming in criminality. And so, for me, and by the way, like the thing that also frustrates me about Democrats is that while I think it makes perfect sense to go after what Trump did in that call with the Ukrainian president, limiting the scope of this impeachment inquiry is incredibly stupid. Because for me, potentially a bigger issue is Donald Trump's financial crimes, right? So
Absolutely.
why wouldn't they want to investigate that? And so all you can really do is speculate as to why they don't want to investigate that. And I don't know, maybe they're worried that if they investigate his financial crimes, it'll bring up their potential financial crimes. I have no idea. All I know is it's a stupid play, and it makes you question the intentions of Democratic leadership. Why is it that they're going to limit themselves by limiting the scope of this investigation?
Yeah, I agree with you 100%. And so my final question on this before we move on then is like, okay, if we're really going to strike the right balance, and I think you're 100% about this balance. Like I've been relatively close to you, but I'm more convinced by you specifically than anybody else in having these conversations. So we know that there's some people who are going to kind of just take us sort of like, it doesn't matter, whatever. It's all corrupt. It's all bullshit, and then ignore the fact that it is all corrupt. It's all bullshit. And just like all of that matters, it matters that there's just like unending grotesque corruption and criminality in every aspect of this Trump world. Then pushing beyond that, let's then go to the other side of it, which, okay, so they're finally going to do it. And then at first, on a practical level, they're going to limit it to this pretty narrow thing. They're not going to talk about financial crimes. They're also not going to talk about things that like he will never get impeached for, but should be, like aiding a genocide in Yemen, like kidnapping and terrorizing families and children at the border. So we know that the same, impotent, ineffectual, cowardly, all of the every bad adjective I could use about the Democratic leadership, I will use if I could. What is the balance that we strike here in our position that you're leading on, which is like, we need to do this, actually matters. We can't just sort of fold into like a cool kid cynicism. And at the same time, we know that the people that institutionally are going to be leading this suck.
Yeah, so I want to make sure I understand your question, because on one hand, I don't think the Democratic leadership would draw attention to the issues on both sides.
Right.
You know, they're going to go ahead and minimize the corruption issue, and they're certainly not going to make a big deal about what's going on in Yemen or what's happening at the border, because who knows, maybe in the future they're going to have a Democrat who's running who would want to do the same thing. Right. I mean, we have a history of Democratic presidents who have, you know, not only expanded Bush-era foreign policy like Obama did, but we're unapologetic about it. So, and we're incredibly cruel to whistleblowers. Right. And that's another thing, by the way, not to go off on too much of a tangent. But, you know, all of this rhetoric coming from mainstream media and establishment Democrats regarding protecting the whistleblower, we need to protect the whistleblower. I completely agree with that notion, but I wish that they would extend that to whistleblowers, including Chelsea Manning and Edward Snowden.
Right.
You know, you can't pick and choose which whistleblowers you want to support based on what your political agenda is at that moment. But, you know, I do think that it's important for the naysayers on the left, the naysayers toward impeachment, to really consider the fact that we don't live in a black and white world. It is absolutely possible to be critical of the corruption on the left while simultaneously understanding the importance of pursuing this impeachment inquiry.
Yeah, I think that really was basically my question, which is like how, I guess those of us in the media or those of us making arguments, but even how somebody just might understand this issue for themselves, like that understanding why this process is justified could even be beneficial does not, you know, it's that not black or white thinking. It doesn't mean that all of a sudden you accept the utter failure of the Democratic Party and buy into that process either. It just means that you're taking on everything at once, basically.
Yeah, and I think that that's honestly what we need to do as progressives. Mm-hmm. As progressives, if we're so lopsided where we're only focusing on one issue, whether it be holding establishment Democrats accountable or only focusing on Trump, I just feel like you're not really thinking about pursuing things strategically. I know that this is a difficult fight. I know that there's a lot going on, but just think about some of the progressive voices out there who are lopsided in their coverage, who do only focus on, let's say, only attacking Democrats while ignoring the fact that Donald Trump is a hideous president who has broken laws while in office, yes, who has been brutal in his foreign policy, who has, you know, has this record of allowing as many as 24 immigrants to die under his watch. I mean, like, he's a terrible person. So it's just not right to do lopsided coverage of what's going on in the world. Now, I will say, like, we do a 3-hour show. And even when we do a 3-hour show, there are days when I leave the office thinking to myself, damn it, we should have covered this. I wish we would have covered this, you know, Democratic corruption story. I wish we would have covered this Trump story that we didn't get to. But, you know, it's a balancing act, and it is important to kind of focus on both things strategically to kind of get what we want.
Strategically, one of the key, if we did one of those bubbles of TMBS words, that would be up there. It would be like Lula, strategically, stupid, or something.
Yeah, definitely. Or bad.
Bad. Very bad. Not ignoring Trump's crimes is very bad for you. Not good. Yeah, I mean, look, there is some level of like it. You know, politics is not being a hype beast. Like some of the stuff that is mainstream and your MSNBC wine mom is concerned about, you should be concerned about, right? Like some of it's as simple as that. You have a great piece that you just wrote for The Hill called Elizabeth Warren's Vagueness on Medicare Isn't Fooling Anyone. Now, you know, there are some of these examples, like the Medicare for All framework comment, there was a lot of pushback on. People said that the broader context of the question was about a very specific issue, which, by the way, I think everybody could agree she clearly didn't have an answer about disability eligibility for people with MS, which was the question. And she did go into vociferously attacking insurance companies. However, and you document this really well in the article, that fits into a long enough of a pattern of super ambiguous statements, as well as the late release of even a healthcare write-up on her webpage, that we really have to start to ask, what's going on here?
Definitely. I mean, if you can think back to January, there was an issue where publicly she said that she was supportive of Medicare for all. She appeared to be unequivocal in her support. And then immediately after that, some of her staffers spoke to the press and backpedaled on it. And so that was, a red flag for me. But then following that, she was super strong on Medicare for all on the debate stage. I had seen other interviews where she was touting the need for Medicare for all, and I was willing to give her the benefit of the doubt, but there was just an increasing amount of evidence to the contrary. Like the CBS interview following the last Democratic debate, where she said, I support Medicare for all. And she had this weird tone to her voice. I know I'm maybe making too much of it, but it was the same high-pitched ending to the sentence that you would expect from someone who's not telling the truth. And then she immediately followed that with, I like a lot of plans. And then that was it. I like a lot of plans? No. Medicare for all is a giant piece of legislation that's going to take a lot to get through Congress. And if you start off with this wishy-washy, well, maybe there are other plans I'm considering, then no, you're not going to fight for it. And everyone's different, so I don't want to be overly judgmental to people who disagree with me. But for me, Medicare for all is non-negotiable.
Yep.
If you don't support Medicare for all, I'm not even interested in having a conversation with you as a candidate. And it's based on my life experiences. It's based on the fact that, my mother had chronic kidney disease and needed a transplant. In 2016, I just remember the fear of not knowing whether we were going to be able to pay her medical bills because her dialysis wasn't covered. I mean, it was just a nightmare. And I don't want anyone to have to go through that. I don't want Americans to suffer from, these record bankruptcies because they can't afford something that should be a basic human right. So if she's going to waffle on that issue, she's not the candidate for me.
Yeah, I agree with you 100%. And I also just want to spell something out that's also really important in this. And you as you pointed out, rightfully so, you've actually read this bill. This bill actually means something, right? We're talking about, so even in the context of the answer, I think, look, no politician is very unlikely, especially if their brand is plans, is going to tell you, I don't know the answer to a specific, highly specific question. But the broader answer is actually really clear and really simple if you were fighting for that, at least from the perspective of the Sanders bill, which is that maybe the Sanders bill doesn't have a specific answer to disability eligibility for MS within the next year, 2, 3, or 4 years. Maybe it doesn't. I don't know. You would know better than me, frankly. But what the bill does have an answer to, and what it spells out in an incredibly clear and detailed way, is that we're going to drop Medicare down in different age increments, from each year till gradually over the course of 4 years, every single American, every single person in this country, regardless of their health status, finances, anything, is going to get full, complete health care. That's
exactly,
there's nothing ambiguous about that.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I'm glad that you brought that up. And, I wish I would have included that answer in the piece that I wrote, because whatever coverage that individual has right now, right, the person who asked that question during Elizabeth Warren's town hall, whatever coverage he has, that coverage will remain until he is transitioned to Medicare for all. And then once he's transitioned to Medicare for all, that single payer system covers everything. So while it's true that the actual legislation written by Bernie Sanders doesn't specify how things would work out for someone who has MS, it does specify what the transition would look like. Now, let's say in, our ideal world where we get Medicare for all, as this transition is happening, it's not like Americans would lose their private insurance. Private insurance wouldn't outright be banned from the get-go. Again, it would be a transition period, and everyone would have the coverage they currently have until they're transitioned into this single-payer healthcare system.
Exactly. So, and I just want to say, too, like, just to also really keep spelling this out. So with Waren, we don't really know. If we look at her website, it sounds like some type of version of Medicare for all, which, at least as it's written on the website, could be more analogous to some type of public option, which is what Buttigieg is talking about when he says Medicare for all who choose it, which is, definitionally absurd. And he has probably the most overtly dishonest position of any of them, I would say. Or she does support some type of basic elemental Medicare for all, but one that is much more limited because, again, the Sanders plan also covers dental and mental health and other really vital services, which as of now, Waren clearly does not. And I just want to really put this on the table, too, because some people, and it's fun, like I've actually been starting to get a little bit into like reading about different global health systems and like, how does it actually work in France? How does it actually work in the United Kingdom? And some people will say like, oh, well, like Germany and France have like socialized medicine, but private insurance still exists. They aren't banned. And I just want to make like incredibly clear that if that's going to be your argument, then your candidate better come forward with a French plan, which has even more aggressive and expansive governmental coverage than the NHS in some ways. And yes, there's a handful of private insurers, which are nonprofits or owned by the shareholders themselves. There is public hospitals. There's paid for maternity and paternity care. Like, let's not use examples from the world that are like way to the left of anything that, Waren or Buttigieg is remotely putting on the table to undermine what is the most comprehensive and progressive plan. Like, let's not bullshit like that, please.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And the United States and our system of government and the legalized bribery that we now have baked into our system of government, in my opinion, makes it very likely that let's say a public option proposal, if we get something like a public option passed, would it be a bit of an improvement from what we have now? Sure. Yeah, absolutely. But it just wouldn't work out in the way that it might in a different country because of the legalized bribery that we have baked into our system. So a good way to, maybe draw parallels is a public option healthcare system to, let's say, public education. Mm-hmm. Okay, so with public education, look at how incredibly easy it was for private interests and, the wealthiest to lobby hard to get public education defunded in America. Mm-hmm. I mean, in California alone, the LAUSD was one of the top public school systems in like the early 1970s. In the late 1970s, Californians passed Prop 13, which is it was a complete and utter disaster. It capped property taxes at a little over 1%. And that's how education is funded. And so once that happened, the public education system was defunded to the point where now the LAUSD is at the bottom of public school systems in the country. Now, in that case, it was a ballot initiative that unfortunately passed. And in order to raise taxes, you need a 2/3 majority among lawmakers in the state of California. That's never going to happen.
Right.
And so the public education system has just completely fallen apart, and it'll continue to fall apart. You look at the private prison model. Look at what private prisons do, and I think this is the same thing that'll happen with private insurers if we get a public option. Private prisons ensure that they only accept prisoners that are inexpensive to imprison, right? So these are low-level drug offenders, people who don't have mental health issues. And then all of the individuals who are, more expensive to incarcerate, people who have mental health issues, for instance, they end up in the public system. And it becomes much more expensive in the public system to incarcerate people. So I bring this up because we're going to have all sorts of challenges and issues with the public option. So for people who think, no, public option is a great, way to go about this, at least you're going to have the ability to take government health insurance if you want it, or you can go to the private system. But it's not that clear cut, and it's not that easy. There's a lot of room for corruption. There's a lot of room for, defunding the government plan.
That's just 100%. I'm so with it. And I also I shy away from the rhetoric of corruption for a lot of different reasons, but I think you're 100% right. And I think that this really does go to the heart of the difference between people who understand the power and corruption dimensions of these questions versus thinking of them as technical challenges, right? Like, if it's just sort of, we could design some elegant technical system and then people can decide, or even if people are going back 10, 15 years, which was like what people did, a public option obviously wasn't even in the ACA, but some of the people who advocated a public option at the time were very clear, at least like in their academic writing, like basically the public option will be so good that it will gradually like morph into Medicare for all, because who the hell wants to deal with private insurance when government healthcare is so much better, right? But we're not at that point now. We're at a point now where it's an all or nothing fight. And I think you're exactly right that the actual constituent power of these interests will shift a higher economic burden onto a public option, but they'll also fight to keep the public option at a lower quality so they can just keep operating a parasitic business which doesn't provide any value. Like, it's useless.
Yeah, I don't believe in creating a two-tiered system for healthcare.
Right.
And to be quite honest with you, I long for the day when we have a presidential candidate who says that there shouldn't be a two-tiered system in education either. Absolutely. I mean, I look at Finland, and they have banned private education. And as a result, they have the best education. They're at the top of all these various rankings because of the fact that they banned private education. So you have, some of the more wealthy individuals paying into the public system. And when I say paying into the public system, it means that they have, they're higher stakes. Like, they actually care about ensuring that the public system works, because their kids are going to public schools. And so I would love for someone like Bernie Sanders to say, you know what? I think I want to do away with private schools as well.
I love it. Bernie Sanders, final couple of minutes. Bernie Sanders put out a Housing for All plan. I was very moved by it. I went over, it's, like funnily enough, all of the plans he's putting out are enormously comprehensive and ambitious. This is an area you know a lot about. You cover a lot on No Filter. What are your sort of main takeaways from his housing plan?
I loved his housing plan. I thought that it was thorough and comprehensive. And for me, the tricky part has always been rent control, because rent control does have unintended consequences when it's not mandated for all properties. But in Bernie's plan, there would be rent control on a federal level. And I think that that's really the key, because when you're protected, regardless of where you rent, that allows you to have more freedom, you have more mobility. It creates a system in which some of these wealthy developers aren't able to pay large sums of money to landlords who own these rent-controlled buildings, because that's really what's happening in places like Los Angeles. The developers will go to landlords who have these buildings. They're rent-controlled, and it's persuasive, right? When a developer comes to you and says, hey, I'm going to give you millions and millions of dollars. I'm going to take this rent-controlled building off your hands. And then they go ahead and they evict everyone because they're going to tear it down and they're going to build these luxury condos. And once they do that, these new buildings aren't rent controlled anymore. And it creates a real issue when it comes to inventory of rent controlled units. So again, I think the key is to make this a federal issue. And that's exactly what Bernie Sanders is proposing. I think that it's a really great proposal.
Yeah, no, I agree with you 100%. And it's funny because I saw a lot, like I've learned from, this is another issue I've definitely learned from you on. But my instinct is that every time I see like concern trolling where, random people are telling me like, well, here's a piece, from 2005 on, why rent control. It's like, to the extent I can, but to me, it just reminds me though of libertarian. It's just neoliberal or libertarian arguments where it's like, yes, you can potentially identify, maybe even like you just articulated, a real problem in a specific municipality, and all signs then point to, well, there you go. The new building is rent controlled too. So therefore there's no incentive for predator capital. And I just think that like between that and the public housing investment and the restitution to people in foreclosure, and even also some of the stuff that's buried in there on like actual real paths for low income home ownership, which he actually goes back to things he pioneered as mayor of Burlington. This could be like, this could actually end homelessness. I mean, it's pretty extraordinary.
Yeah, absolutely. And I hear you when it comes to that concern trolling, because I've come across it quite a bit. And so it's been difficult for me to talk about rent control because people are already primed to have like a negative reaction to some of the critiques toward rent control as it stands today. But I do think that there are honest actors out there, you know, myself included, who want rent control. But we have to think about some of the unintended consequences so we can mitigate that. And again, Bernie Sanders is so incredibly smart, and he did think about those unintended consequences. And his solution is to make this a federal issue.
Awesome. On a final note, Tulsi Gabbard, maybe not so progressive.
I don't know. I think someone's been warning people for a while now, but that person got smeared quite a bit. Yeah, so not supportive of Medicare for all, wasn't supportive of impeachment until she got enough backlash that she flipped on it.
Yeah, she did flip on that one. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, look, I mean, someone who's an apologist for Modi, I don't know how anyone can argue is a progressive, but it is what it is. At least she's showing her true colors now.
No, 100%. No, the only reason, I mean, I'm being a little flippant because you and I have been talking about this for a long time, and you've taken just so much disgusting heat for saying obvious and important things on this. But I mean, two reasons. One, yes, if we're actually in the phase now where we're literally defending Modi, that actually points to much more disturbing things that we're going to need to talk about at another time. And look, guys, like, you know, especially, frankly, you know, being willing to be honest and clear about Waren, you know, can definitely earn you some whining and some upset, you know, from more people. But I would say, like, look, you know, if you are holding the progressive badge, in the same way I'm willing to say to Waren people, like, are you fucking kidding me with this Tulsi nonsense? Like, literally every vote counts. And I would hope if you support or claim to support a real agenda, I think it's time to get serious about Bernie. But, you know, that's just my pitch. But I'm right.
Yeah, I agree.
Anna Kasparian, you're awesome. I appreciate your time as always. Everybody check out No Filter. Go subscribe to it on iTunes and on the YouTube page. And of course, you can find Anna where she is the co-host and executive producer of TYT.
Thank you so much, Michael.
Hey, folks, we're back. We've got a lot to get to in the postgame. Oh, wait, do we have that drop, Matt? Who's going to be on the postgame, Matt? What's the postgame going to be?
Oh, wait, which one do you want?
Oh, come on. What's going to be on the postgame? This is intuitive. There's no guest. It's the three of us.
You think captains of industry like...
No, not boys. The boys. Anyways, all right. But first,
I'm not in lad culture.
We have a couple of, yes, it's going to be lad culture. So we have a few things to get to, though, before we get to the postgame where we're talking about Haiti. We're doing the debunk on Venezuela. We are talking in a brief intro to world systems theory, and we might take some calls depending on the time. But first, there is a gentleman in this studio who learned hillbilly Marxism at the knee of his grandpappy. And that man's name is David Griscom. That's actually pretty good.
I like it.
I think this is the hillbilly Marxist minute. By the way,
I don't think hillbilly is a Texas.
That's what my bio says.
What did you say?
Honky tonk Marxist.
Honky tonk Marxist. I like hillbilly Marxist better. Do we have honky tonk Marxist is really good though? Do we have the right graphic up for this? Because we used the wrong one the other day.
Yes, we did.
Okay, and it was back to Akananinik.
Yeah.
All right,
a throwback.
Throwback. By the way, there might be another extremely prominent Marxist economist joining this show sometime soon, who might also want to kick your ass. David Griscom.
I'm glad I've been in the gym.
What do we got, brother?
Yeah, unfortunately, this is a very tragic story that has been missed a lot, and it's been going on for a long time, but it is the plight of the rural hospitals across the country. Now, obviously, we're facing a healthcare crisis for everybody in the United States, but it's really hitting rural communities hard. Just so people can understand this, currently 21% of rural hospitals are at high risk of closing. And when you start to look at specific states, for example, Alabama, 50% of rural hospitals are at high risk of closing. In Maine, 40% of rural hospitals are at high risk of closing. And in Michigan, 25.4% are at high risk of closing. And not only is this really dangerous for people who need health care, it's really damaging for local economies, because that means that all the registered nurses, all the doctors, all the people who work in the healthcare system lose their jobs and then leave the community, zapping a massive portion of economic activity and taking areas that are already very deprived economically and making them much, much worse. And then, of course, we're talking about no access to ambulance services. If there's any kind of emergency, people having to drive 2 to 3 hours to get to the nearest hospital. And this crisis is especially bad in states that have blocked Medicaid expansion in recent years. So obviously a lot of Republican-run states have been really hit hard by this crisis. Shout out to my former professor, Luke Mayville, for doing the important work in Idaho of fighting for Medicaid expansion. But even that, even getting that on the ballot, they're still having to fight the state government there for it. So they
tried to lula Luke.
No, I mean,
we'll talk about that more later. They literally, the one of the far right groups tried to put fake campaign finance charges on him. This stuff is real.
Yeah, Mayville Livre.
Mayville Livre.
I mean, seriously, those are really despicable when you start to see and you realize that they're playing with people's lives. And this is a larger story here, and I think we should cover this again in the future. But the story of rural America, where you've seen the disappearance of a lot of industry and manufacturing that created a lot of these towns. And then also just the dominance of massive agribusiness that's destroyed local farms. I mean, people, if you want to do like any kind of agriculture, like raising pigs or beef on a small scale, it's really difficult to do that because the rule book is so skewed in the favor of these massive corporations. Mm-hmm. But obviously, these areas are facing obviously the issues of there not being enough economic activity and also smaller numbers in communities to maintain a hospital, but then also a lot of people who are uninsured, and especially in these rural communities, these are people making like $7.50, $8, $9 an hour. When they go into the emergency room, then they basically, put that money becomes bad debt that the hospital's carrying. So especially in these really poor communities, it's really difficult for them to operate because people aren't able to afford their medical bills in the first place. And our Medicaid system currently, even though it's very important to expand Medicaid as possible, you're not paying a full dollar as you would from private insurance. So they actually get paid a little bit less than they typically would. So those hospitals also are operating with smaller margins. So this is why when we talk about Medicare for all, it's such an important fight, because a lot of these hospitals, especially in poor communities that have had to shut down because they just can't operate on their current insurance system using Medicaid in the first place, Medicare for all is going to massively expand the amount of money that goes into those hospitals and allowing that care to be maintained. Bernie Sanders has been a real leader in trying to fight to make sure that rural hospitals don't close. He wants to make sure that communities have the first right to be able to buy hospitals if they are going under. He wants to make sure that the United States federal government is investing in rural communities, and especially their hospitals, but also their economies in general, so that these people aren't being left behind. So one, when we're talking about this massive hospital crisis, Medicare for all is a huge part of changing that. And then also a jobs guarantee, because one of the most important things about the jobs guarantee is that we can direct where we want that investment to go. So communities that have been underserved by the economy for a very long time can be revitalized in a few years. We've done it once before with the WPA as a part of the New Deal. Not only do we think about, when we talk about the WPA, we're talking about things like the Cathedral of Learning in Pittsburgh. We're talking about all these incredible investments in major cities, but also public parks, a lot of town squares. If you go through a lot of rural towns in America, you actually will see, oh wow, this statue here, this public park was created as part of the New Deal. We can revitalize these communities. We can invest in universal child care. We can invest in all these communities if we have the political will and we move away from a system of extraction that has left the majority of people behind, and especially rural Americans very far behind. And just, one really quick point to, when we're talking about this, it's certainly a class issue, but it's also a racial justice issue. If you want to say that you stand with black and brown people, you need to be talking about black and brown people across the United States South. There's huge concentrations of black rural communities that have been so underserved because of racism, because of capitalism, and because of the American system. And we really want to revitalize those communities, and that's going to be a huge part of any kind of left or socialist future.
100%. So would he take you out fishing?
Bernie?
No, I'm talking like your pappy, grandpappy. Your Uncle Pappy.
My Uncle Pappy?
Yeah,
I was a hunter. I was a hunter and I fished.
Like, we're gonna go out to the gorge. You're gonna learn about the labor theory of value, young man.
But I grew up on a ranch. I grew up and I took care of cattle.
Yeah,
we raised goats. It's something that's important to me for a lot of reasons. So I'm familiar with that part of the world too.
You're gonna skin the goats and talk about the enclosure of the commons, young man.
Hell yeah.
Yeah, this actually sounds like a very cool guy that I'm making up in my head.
Yeah, I wish that was the case.
Yeah. Yeah, well, we all wish that things like that were the case. Okay. So, a couple of segments to get to. We're going to have a bit of a shorter show this week and get faster to the postgame. What happened?
No, just a minor audio hiccup.
Uncle Pappy didn't
it was
teach
electrical.
you how to handle the electrics. I like this. Uncle Pappy, David Griscom's Marxist economic mentor. It's like what they didn't tell you about was that the base defines the superstructure. Your problem is, young man, you're high. You're high on superstructure, low on base. It's also the way he taught you about the birds and the bees. Foreign policy really matters. And it's elemental to this show. Yes, I will be throwing to that. And it matters because, first of all, look, there's a whole wide world. And it is an interdependent world. That word has been so abused. There's a sort of superficial fantasy world of globalization interdependence. There's actually Buddhist and Asian systems and indigenous systems of describing interdependence that are quite powerful. There's a Marxist understanding of interdependence, linking different supplies and chains of production, trade, commodities, military strategy, empire, and all of the other facets of the world system. In the United States, you get to at least play a nominal role in defining how the U.S. empire behaves. And this is important because it affects every single inch of life on Earth. This is important because the problems that are generated by globalization, by military policy, by interventionism, by basing, first of all, oppress brutally much of the world, and secondly, also loop back here. You cannot separate migration patterns from coups, from ecological crisis. As always, I expect people to be able to think through several things at once. We need to 100% abolish ICE, conform to international law on refugees. In the United States, there is absolutely zero problem at the border. And the only reason we aren't letting people in is because of racism, xenophobia, and fear-mongering. However, if we want to create a systems analysis of this, we need to understand things like the coup in Honduras, like our military basing, like our interventionism in the Middle East, like our acceleration of the climate crisis. and in all these other areas that we continuously destabilize. Kashmir is an incredible, dangerous part of the world right now, accelerated by the Indian government, that we won't hold accountable. We haven't thought about how to innovate foreign policy and diplomacy in such a way that we could actually confront China on its treatment of the Uyghurs in a way that, of course, has nothing to do with military or jingoism, but recognizes that, again, we are interdependent and we don't want that kind of systems abuse of anybody. Our role in Afghanistan and Pakistan helps destabilize the South Asian continent. So I say this all as a preamble, and they might even be two separate clips, to say again that this stuff really matters, and not just for people who are curious or people who, want to study it in college and, God forbid, either kind of neocon monsters who want to fulfill their own lack of substance and virility by playing stratego with the world, and certainly, my God, please not neoliberals who want to have nothing to do with solving systemic crises in this country, but want to go do moral wish fulfillment in Africa, as an example. There's a lot of problems of a lot of archetypes that are drawn to international affairs. But it matters. And it also matters quite practically in a presidential election, because out of the gate, presidential candidates, presidents have the most power over foreign policy, period. No single person denies that on day one, there is power over a massive foreign policy apparatus. There's another apparatus of things that you can do on domestic policy, for sure. And then there is the argument about how you implement a change agenda. Do you bring a movement to it? Do you create systems change? Do you try to confront the whole system because we're at such a crisis point? That's the Bernie Sanders argument. Or do you somehow try to triangulate an argument between a sort of progressive push within the parameters of discredited systems and institutions, the Waren argument? And we can go back and forth on those arguments. I think one has a lot more evidence behind it, but it is all speculative. Foreign policy is not speculative. Drones are under your control. The National Security Council is advising you. You have immediate power over military action, over trade, over how the intelligence services are organized. And in fact, actually, another way of looking at it is that you do have an enormous amount of control, but you actually go up against the undemocratic bureaucracy that engines foreign policy. That after a particularly post-World War II world, there is this entire infrastructure that, frankly, if it hadn't turned into a goofy conspiracy theory term, an alt-right term, you could call it a deep state. There is a self-licking ice cream cone of systems, the intelligence services, private military and intelligence contractors, the Pentagon and others that control an enormous amount of resource and fuel a foreign policy that follows the logic of empire in very specific ways. It is an engine of U.S. capital interests overseas. It is an engine of aggression and of keeping the world conforming to the U.S. Anglo-dominated system. That's it. And a president, for both ethical reasons and also because of the fact that the world is changing radically, are we going to have a power system shift between the United States and China that doesn't lead to crisis? Is a fundamental question. Are we going to have a power system shift that allows us to have a shift with China while still, as an example, talking about the Uyghurs, the occupation of Tibet? And by the way, allowing China releases reports sometimes on our race record. Good, as they should. That's the world we're entering. We need a plan for it. Bernie Sanders is bringing people like Matt Duss to the table who are really thinking about these things. They're saying, let's have a global Green New Deal where we partner with Russia and China. Let's have a green technology transfer to countries that are historically oppressed and in the periphery. Let's globalize a fight to fight the broader ecological crisis. Let's really look at how a global oligarchy works and how that relates to our trade policies, which are written by corporations across the globe. Let's finally cut the defense budget. These things are non-negotiable. And I want to put that in place while I get to a questionnaire that was recently delivered to the Council on Foreign Relations by Elizabeth Warren. this again, and part of the frustration is I can hear people in the back of my head with these, all of the kind of generalized complaints about criticizing Waren, but I really want you to listen to this. This stuff actually matters. So I won't give another preamble, but it really matters. I'm going to focus on a couple of specific areas here. This is question 2. What would you do to rejoin the 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JPOA? What changes to the entire agreement, if any, would you require before agreeing to rejoin the accord? Now, again, this is the Iran nuclear deal that Iran followed to the T. The Trump administration smacking everybody in the face, including the U.S. lackeys like the United Kingdom. The only people who are on board with this are the Saudis and the Israelis, destroyed this deal while implementing a new sanctions regime, which is literally designed to murder average Iranians, block them from getting cancer medications, block them from buying safe jets for their domestic air fleets. So I recognize the limits on domestic American politics. Nobody's going to put it as strongly as I put it while they run for president. But you would say this deal is an enormously important deal. It's a fulcrum of international security. Then trash the Trump administration for being reckless, dangerous, stupid, egotistical, neocon, and grotesque for putting the whole world in danger, which these Trump thugs have done by destroying the Iran deal. And then, by the way, if you're Bernie Sanders, you can say, I was the only member of the Senate and the Democratic caucus to vote against Iran sanctions in 2017, which helped accelerate the Trump administration's approach. Warren can't say that because she voted the wrong and dangerous way on that bill, just as she voted the wrong and dangerous way to make John Brennan the CIA director. But listen to how she answers this question. If Iran returns to compliance with its obligations under the nuclear deal, the United States should return as well. If Iran is not in compliance, I will pursue a strong and principled diplomacy in concert with our allies to bring both the United States and Iran back into the deal. The JCPOA is only the beginning. We will need to negotiate a follow-up on that agreement that continues to constrain Iran's nuclear program past the sunset of some of its original terms. We also need to address serious concerns about Iran's policy beyond its nuclear program, including its ballistic missile program and support for destabilizing regional proxies. The JCPOA made addressing these problems easier by taking the threat of nuclear-armed Iran off of the table. And then she goes on to repeat some correct things about Trump, but, sure, whatever. This is a stunning way to frame this issue. If Iran returns to compliance, Iran stepped out of compliance with this deal after the Trump administration had torn the deal up, threatened Iran, moved aggressively in sanctions and military action, have threatened military action against Iran on a regular basis. The Iranians finally took a few small steps to enrich beyond the deal, clearly, by every indication, as simply a signal that you can't endlessly bully us. Now, she could have answered that question in a way that at the very least, clearly and definitively, pinned the blame on the Trump administration. It's both politically effective and true. Then she goes on to talk about these other things. And I will remind everybody, first of all, Iran, within the context of the historical accords on nonproliferation, is within its rights to enrich uranium. This is already highly unusual globally to even have an agreement like this. The original arms control was this idea of atoms for peace. We're going to accept that there's 5 countries in the world that have nukes. If everybody else signs the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty, you can use nuclear energy. So already, we're accepting that Iran is outside of the bounds, even as there has never been definitive proof that Iran is pursuing a weapons program. And I think clearly they've actually pursued a policy of strategic ambiguity. There's rhetorical signals they've sent in the past that maybe they would. They certainly they totally dismantled the Shah's program after the Iranian Revolution and restarted elements of it during the Iran-Iraq War, when Saddam Hussein was literally using chemical weapons on Iran, and every single permanent member of the UN Security Council was selling weapons to Iraq. So there's a reason why there's Iranian paranoia here. So at the same time, no intelligence estimates from any reputable intelligence agency, if you even want to take them seriously, has ever definitively established an Iranian nuclear program for weapons purposes, and their leadership consistently denies it. Obviously, I wouldn't take it at face value. I'd take nobody at face value. But to be very clear, it's reported in the U.S. press that this is analogous to North Korea or Pakistan or something. It's not. Absolutely not. So she totally misframes it. Then she brings in these poison pill secondary issues, which were originally brought up to kill the Iran deal in 2015. Oh, we can't have a deal because of Hezbollah, because of ballistic missiles. Now, the reality is that the JCPOA actually, if you wanted to set up the path for the United States to, first of all, get the hell out of the Middle East militarily, which Matt Thus has said the Sanders administration wants to do, which is first and foremost vital and hugely important. It doesn't mean there isn't diplomatic, commercial, and all sorts of engagement. But it says we can't keep dominating that region militarily, and we can't keep wasting and harming human lives and resources in that way. So that's number one. And then number two, the Saudi-Israeli axis needs to be changed. It doesn't mean that we like Iran. It doesn't mean we agree with everything that Iran does. But frankly, even these so-called proxy groups that she says are destabilizing, they're not from a U.S. perspective. They have nothing to do with U.S. security interests unless you accept a slavish devotion to Saudi Arabia and Israel, which no modern foreign policy maker should. And this isn't even left-wing stuff. This is a very realist calculation. So it's disturbing just the repetition of all of the cliches and brain-dead thinking here. Then it goes on, and she has a section on North Korea, which is we need a serious, realistic negotiations to address the threat. As a first step in coordination with partners and allies, I'd be prepared to consider a partial limited sanctions relief in return for a strong, verifiable agreement that keeps North Korea from expanding its arsenal or proliferating from other countries. That might be okay-ish. That would return us back to maybe even something like what's happening in the Clinton era. But clearly, there's no real strategy there. And look, I was never somebody who look, is Trump's fixation on the North Korean leader bizarre? Yes. Is his fixation on dictators generally unhealthy and weird? Yes. Has nothing really been accomplished between the United States and North Korea? Absolutely. However, the Bernie Sanders is the only one so far that I'm aware of to say, of course Trump should have met with him. Are you crazy? I mean, this is something you don't have to overthink. The fact of these two egomaniacs meeting each other and having a direct line and Trump thinking he has a personal bond with him has absolutely reduced the likelihood of a catastrophe. And the South Koreans have wanted this under moderate leadership. When is somebody going to say, and again, baby steps, but when is somebody going to say, look, North Korea is an obscene regime. They have a disgusting domestic human rights record. They do all sorts of horrible things. Incidentally, they have a justifiable worry because they're surrounded by a ring of U.S. military presence. They're under constant threat themselves. And like any other regime, they have a rational survival instinct, regardless of what we think of the ethics of any of these regimes. And we also just need to recognize, like, they have nukes. It happened. They've got it. So what's the next plan that's real? That isn't a cliche to contain this situation. And incidentally, what lesson do you keep sending the rest of the world? The United States supports a coup in Brazil through the last several years because Dilma announces basically that we have these new oil deposits that are discovered. They're going to go through a state oil company and fund education into perpetuity. You can look it up several years ago. And then that starts to correlate with the Edward Snowden revelations, huge aggressive spying on Dilma, but also Petrobras as a company. And then the DOJ backs this Lava Jato travesty. So it all connects. Look at Gaddafi. Another obscenity of a leader right there. But let me tell you something. That guy said he chose, I'm back in the world system. Let me get rid of my nukes. And then Sarkozy was like, I think I want to get rid of the evidence of your campaign contributions to me, allegedly. And we were only all too happy to go along with it. There's deals to be made. It could probably be even easier to suck up Libya's resources. Now Libya literally has open air slave markets again. Okay, and that destabilization has spread into Mali and across the whole region. Very, totally conventional stuff on Ukraine. I've made it a point a million times. Russia has its own imperial influence. I'm not a justifier of Russia, but I also do not want to have a ultra hawkish policy there at all, which threatens the globe. She makes some good signals on Afghanistan, although, to me, it's so vague and still speaks of so many sort of economic and other forms of assistance that it doesn't seem to me like the type of plan that can really end the self-licking ice cream cone that is that occupation, which is still killing an enormous amount of civilians, which she does not mention once. And also nothing about what even Trump was willing to do, of course, before he wrecked it. But it's like, yeah, you need to negotiate with the Taliban. You need to. That's the only way it's going to happen. She says she wants to encourage a political settlement between the Afghan government and the Taliban that's sustainable and protects U.S. interests. So, again, potentially some good signals there. And I realize I misstated in the first. She does acknowledge the importance of negotiating a political settlement with the Taliban. I don't know if she means a direct U.S. role in it or facilitating between them and the Afghan government. Nothing on civilian casualties. Briefly, when she talks about Saudi Arabia, she says the Saudi-led war in Yemen exacerbates instability and extremism in the region and has resulted in the deaths of thousands of civilians. So, this is the nitpick portion, but I would say a lot more. It's caused significant more death than that, including things like cholera outbreaks and hunger. And every time Bernie Sanders talks about his work on Yemen, he talks about it being one of the great murder fields in the world today, and that it's abomination what we support in Saudi Arabia. And I just think it's very revealing, the lack of engagement on that. I'm sorry. Here's something that is very disturbing. Now, there's one candidate who said that they will consider suspending U.S. aid to Israel. Bernie Sanders. Pete Buttigieg has made something if they formally annex the West Bank. Okay. Bernie Sanders has actually said, as a tool of diplomacy, we will potentially consider that to hold Israel accountable. This is on Israel. Do you support a two-state solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? If so, what would you go about to achieve it? Now, of course, even the question is pablum, and how a two-state is even logistically possible. Setting that aside, notice how Waren, who was an aggressive supporter of the Israeli bombardment on Gaza in 2014 and didn't flinch when presented with evidence of Israel bombing schools and hospitals, and has said steadily, that she will not take any actual action to hold Israel to account in this. But this is the quintessential of her campaign. Check out the wokeness of the language now. I believe in the worth and value of every Israeli and every Palestinian. Okay, well, that sounds great. So far, so good. What's the material upshot of that? The way we respect all parties is through a two-state solution, an outcome that's good for U.S. interests, good for Israeli security, its future, and good for Palestinian aspirations for dignity and self-determination. To achieve this, there must be an end to the Israeli occupation and the creation of an independent and sovereign Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza Strip, living alongside Israel. As president, I would immediately take immediate steps to reestablish America's role as a credible mediator, welcoming the Palestinian General Delegation back to Washington and reopening an American mission to the Palestinians in Jerusalem. She also said she's not even talking about anything about the even the shifting the U.S. embassy out of Jerusalem, as an example. And then she goes on to make a couple of things that are necessary, but were bipartisan consensus until Trump, like supporting the UNRWA mission, things like that. I will oppose incitement to violence and support for terrorism by Palestinian extremists like Hamas, and I will make clear my unequivocal opposition to Israeli settlement activity and to any moves in the direction of annexation of the West Bank. Well, first of all, if you won't put aid on the table, you don't mean anything. That's the bottom line. If she said, I will suspend aid to Israel day one because settlements have never stopped. And then the other part with Hamas, look, how was peace achieved in Northern Ireland? You have to deal with every power. You have to deal with every faction here. So the pablum and the repetition about Hamas is just pablum. There's not going to be any change here. And if you combine that with her previous relentless support, and during the campaign, Bernie posed with the End the Occupation Now activists. Those signals matter. And you combine that with the demented answer on Iran, blaming Iran for that, we're in really big trouble here. Then we go to Venezuela. Maduro's a dictator and a crook who has wrecked his country's economy, dismantled its democratic institutions, and profited while his people suffer. The United States should lead the international community in addressing Venezuela's humanitarian crisis and supporting regional efforts to negotiate a political transition, including free and fair elections as soon as possible. So then why has she not supported AMLO? Why has she not supported the Norway process? Why has she not said very clearly that obviously the U.S. propping of Guaido is illegitimate? Now, again, these are outside the realm of what most U.S. politicians are going to say, including Sanders. But the reality is, if you're going to use that rhetoric, there are multiple diplomatic processes happening now, and they're happening from the periphery, whether it's in the Caribbean or Northern Europe. She hasn't supported any of that. And in fact, people didn't like Bernie's phrasing several months ago, but he did, at the end of the day, oppose the escalation in Venezuela several months ago. She did not. And when you talk about other regional players, who exactly are we talking about here? Brazil and Colombia as far-right clients of the United States? Then she said, we must also pressure China, Russia, and Cuba to become constructive players in the crisis. And if they refuse, we must contain their damaging and destabilizing actions. Well, okay, same.
Yeah.
I
mean, like, even worse in that situation, too. We're quite literally destabilizing the entire country by
we are. Yeah, I mean, we're radically destabilizing it.
Yeah.
Yes, we recognized an illegitimate government and have been trying to wage coups in Venezuela going back to 2002. So there is what?
But it's Cuba.
But it's Cuba, so it's bad. And again, these are the types of answers. The point is that, because I saw some people say, well, what's wrong with this? What's wrong with it is that it's all conventional pablum. And if you go into the White House with conventional pablum, going up against the strongest institutional interests, there will be no change in foreign policy. And that means, and you'll see a repetition of the people like Samantha Power and all these people who've presided over all of these democratic catastrophes. And what that will mean is, along with her voting record, a continued skyrocketing military budget, a completely unchecked Israeli apartheid, no redeeming of the Iran deal, and that is an optimistic area, and the ongoing subjugation of Latin America and the Caribbean, which is economically horrifying, militarily horrifying, and again, continues to generate the conditions that lead to things like migration at rates that are not people choosing to go where they want to go, but literally needing to flee for their lives, which we should all oppose. Seems pretty obvious. And mostly what she's talked about is trade, which I think it's great that she opposes these corporate trade deals, but she always talks about it from the perspective of the American worker and American business interest, which is interesting because, we're just not in that world anymore. We are in a globalized economy. So the question is how are we going to have a globalized, abundant economy that works for all, not some imagined middle-class past that we cannot recreate? And then I just want to note this because, one of the things we try to do on the show when we talk to someone like Milton Alamati and cover certain stories is take Africa seriously. And if you look at, especially in this sort of like weird liberal mindset, there's, okay, we have double standards. Obviously, it's okay to be kind of racist towards Palestinians, although that language will get much more woke now without any follow through. Asia's, that's an area where we can kind of get in, and certainly Russia, we can engage in our xenophobia and competitive instincts. The Europeans, we kind of admire and want to emulate. I'm talking about the liberal mindset here, but they're subordinate to us. Latin America and the Caribbean, there's actually a lot of contempt for. in that relationship, although we need to sort of signal some respect because of domestic constituencies at home. And then Africa, even as we continue in a post-colonial mode to compete with China and France in an ongoing post-colonial relationship with Africa through exploitative trade deals, through an expansion of things like AFRICOM and military presence there. But in the mind, there's still this notion of Africa as, oh, well, let's help out Mother Africa. Poor Africa. Those are the undeserving poor. Not a vitally important continent, which is fast growing, which is obviously the victim of huge historic crimes, which has dynamism, challenges, has produced extraordinary leaders across the continent, produced extraordinary crimes across the continent, has a complicated, dynamic process, which, encompasses unbelievable geographic linguistic diversity. So this is the type of thing that the Waren people won't like because they'll say it's petty, blah, blah, blah. But I'm sorry, it matters that this is the kind of, 1990s model UN stuff. By 2050, Africa will account for 25% of the world's population, according to projections by the United Nations. What are the implications of this demographic shift for the United States, and how should we adjust our policies to anticipate them? Africa is made up of diverse countries. I wish I could have some type of UN speech under this, or some type of we can't because of those schmucks, but almost like a West Wing. What would work with this? I'm trying to think. Probably not Mission Impossible. All right. Africa is made up of diverse countries with differing objectives and needs, and it makes little sense to think of them with a singular policy. My administration will treat the region as a priority rather than an afterthought. Achieving this requires fresh, innovative diplomacy that prioritizes engagement with civil society as much as with governments, and we should seize on opportunities to promote transparent government and more equitable, inclusive growth that supports a vibrant middle class, including through efforts to tackle wealth concentration, kleptocracy, and corruption. I don't know how that fits with this idea of being a point person for U.S. business interests and competitive advantage. Because if you look at the capital drain out of Africa, yes, there's problems in local governance, but the amount of foreign direct investment and the amount of capital that is still sucked up by the core out of Africa is still stunning. And I have to say, look, as far as contrast goes, you go back to 1988 and Bernie Sanders is sitting at some forum in Burlington telling you how World Bank, IMF structural adjustment programs work and how they impose austerity to pay off Western banks and then open up unregulated areas for Western exploitation and business. Again, this is just another area. I'll just end on this. You don't have the choice in this election between, obviously, we're just going to promote AFRICOM and drones and greater military partnerships and maybe kick in a little bit more for foreign aid to Africa versus, Donald Trump's racism and complete lack of understanding of the continent, or some neoconservative Christian something or other. You have an option of somebody who has historically understood the role in the center in exploiting the periphery. What is that? Is that from the streets?
Yeah, someone has a really loud bass.
That's incredible. So anyways, you guys want to weigh in on this? Look, foreign policy really matters. They have power over this day one. Get serious.
I just want to add about specifically the Africa question at the end, that if you're very serious about aiding and helping out the continent, taking very seriously the amount of extraction that American companies specifically are conducting in Africa, why don't you talk very seriously about American corporations pulling profits out of Africa that are generated in Africa and bringing them back into the United States? I'd also add that the second part of the answer to that question is also very worrying. Because it's all focused on population growth.
You know what?
Yeah.
That's really important. This is really,
you're
absolutely
about
right.
paternalistic way of talking about an entire continent of people. It gets into some of the more dangerous tropes about Africa. I'm all in favor of, trying to do as much work as we can to make sure that women have access to whatever healthcare choices that they want to make. But when you start talking about population growth,
rapid population growth in Africa has the potential to exacerbate environmental and social stressors and have been seen to produce mass youth unemployment, impacting security and regional economies beyond the continent. Now, I have to say, Bernie Sanders got this very weird Malthusian question at a forum, and he, as he understood the question, just pivoted to, I support women's right to choose. This is an actual echoing of that kind of talking point. And again, as David says, of course, family planning, reproductive justice is a global goal and essential in a variety of metrics. But the notion that you are going to frame the problems in rising, like she just talked about environmental stressors. We just told you the environmental stressors. It's rare earth minerals. It's the complete destruction of a place like a Congo because of Western corporate interests. Your phone is fueling tremendous violence and ecological instability. And so the notion that we get into this Bill Gates mindset of, well, God, we got to worry about the population growth of Malawi. No, we got to worry about slashing global emitting from the center of the economy. That's how you deal with it, not weird minding and paternalism about other people's populations. And so if you're reading this the right way and you're reading it critically and you're thinking about foreign policy, all indications here of a return to the destructive past. And when it comes to certain domestic areas, even the worst Democrat is going to, cut home heating oil less than a Republican. And in that tiny margin is a lot of lives. And that's why I've always recommended strategic voting. In foreign policy, that gap is even smaller. And if you think we can go back to a conventional foreign policy, either from a strategic standpoint of our relationship to China and the changing global dynamic, or you think it is appropriate to continue to have a completely colonial relationship to the Caribbean and Latin America, we're just doing fundamentally different things politically.
If I just wanted to add one more thing on the Africa question too.
Yeah.
If you're serious about the ideals that she sort of presents at the beginning of her question, and you don't talk about debt,
that's right.
I mean, you're really she says that she doesn't want to treat Africa as an afterthought. If you're not talking about debt, Africa is an afterthought, in my opinion.
I agree with you 100%. Let's just go real quick. There's this piece in the Black Agenda report. It's really smart. Failures of the U.S. left. The U.S. left completely conveniently ignores that, and you can't be a socialist and not be an anti-imperialist. And they go on actually to talk very specifically really about some of this kind of relationship of sort of like branding of certain kinds of politics domestically that can get completely divorced from the U.S. global role. And it was a very smart piece in the Black Agenda report that I recommend people check out. All right.
I would just make a quick point about progressive versus socialist, is that progressive is mainly kind of socialist light that's okay with empire.
I mean, look, what is the origin of the word progressive, right? We've got to be really clear here. I think there's a great debate between a realization. What Bernie Sanders is doing at his best and what the Sanders campaign is doing at their best is they're really following the lead of A. Philip Randolph. A. Philip Randolph is one of the most important leaders in American history. And A. Philip Randolph and MLK with the Jobs for Justice, what was that battle? End and dismantle American apartheid, establish equal rights, which is obviously an ongoing struggle and fight, and then recognize, out of the New Deal, we have the beginnings of a social democracy and a labor democracy here. We need to, again, end apartheid in that and have everybody participate in it. That is what the Sanders is putting on the table from a policy perspective. That's what's happening. So that's the tradition that it's attempting to emulate that. And to me, of course, I think A. Philip Randolph is the finest American political tradition imaginable. That's my opinion. Teddy Roosevelt and the progressives were great on breaking up big business. They had concerns for the environment. They had some understanding of the underdog.
Yeah, populism.
They had populism. They were imperialists on foreign policy. They drew no connection between the domestic reality and the international one. And they also were comfortable still with the class system. Now, look, Bernie Sanders is not going to abolish the class system. The program does not abolish the class system. But it is very interesting to me. Warren's emphasis is on predator capitalism, screwing over people through various games and asymmetric outcomes. Bernie just widens it out and is like, well, why deal with this bullshit at all? Decommodify healthcare, significantly decommodify housing, and of course, aggressively regulate Wall Street and so on. But it is not based in some understanding that if you can jigger it right, then the right people will be rewarded, right? So I think that gets increasingly clear, especially with her kind of, what Anna talked about, the ongoing equivocating about Medicare for all. Look, it's a real choice, guys. It's a real choice. It's a very real choice. And I think it's stunning to not take the opportunity on the most progressive candidate in modern history. And I guess arguably ever, who has a shot of winning the presidency. Let's talk a little Lula Livre. So again, bringing it to the full picture, because Edward Snowden's been in the news because all of a sudden there's a lot of Democrats who are very concerned about whistleblowers, even as they still don't talk about Edward Snowden, and even as they continue to let Chelsea Manning languish. I'd like to hear all candidates, by the way, talk about what they're going to do about whistleblowers. And at some point, people are going to need to make principled objections to the prosecution of Assange for what he's getting charged with, which is literally doing journalism. It's a threat to all journalism. So one of the things that Edward Snowden revealed, as I said before, was that the NSA was aggressively spying on allies across the world, including Germany and so on, but they were really aggressive about Brazil and Petrobras. And I have no doubt, and now it's expanded. There's the Grijalva letter, the Grijalva resolution, demanding answers from the DOJ and its relationship to Lava Jato, which is, of course, the corrupt political operation that was aimed at the Workers' Party, which generated the trumped-up and fraudulent charges which have made Lula a political prisoner, which facilitated Bolsonaro becoming president. And I would just say this, too. This is speculative, but I would say that, the people in the Lava Jato in that world and its backers and the oligarchs, they probably wanted some mainstream right-wing oligarch Brazilian party to replace, to win the 2018 election. But I bet that Bolsonaro was a very early plan B. I'll just put it that way. And never, ever trust capitalists' effort to dissociate themselves from the most rank fascists. Lava Jato continues to get embarrassed. Just recently, one of the lead prosecutors, not in Lava Jato, but a backer of Lava Jato, who held a big prosecutorial role in the Dilma era, recently said that there is a Brazilian Supreme Court justice who's been sympathetic to Lula, and this guy said that he considered killing him several years ago. And the Supreme Court justice released a letter saying, I thought that I was basically, when I was spending time with this prosecutor, I thought I was only in danger of having my time wasted with his stupidity. I didn't realize my life was in danger. And it's caused another round of deserved embarrassment in the Brazilian judicial system. 2 months ago, Lava Jato prosecutors tried to remove Lula from the special prison he's in at the police headquarters in Curitiba and put him in general population where his life would have been in danger. His legal team fought that off with civil society and even political support and actually finally won a Supreme Court case. And now all of a sudden, 2 months later, these people, after ransacking his home, stealing his grandson's iPad and never giving it back, having illegal wiretaps, illegally releasing conversations, doing everything they can to try to destroy him, as all of a sudden they've said he should have house arrest for good behavior. Lula has written, and it's going to become a legal fight because he says he's not leaving without full exoneration. He doesn't want any more bullshit. He's innocent of these charges. He's not leaving without full exoneration. And here he is from an interview that was done in Brazil 247, which is a great leftist Brazilian website that has actually used some of our stuff and that our friends over at Brazil Wired, Brian Mayer, does great work for. This is Lula in an interview with them explaining why he would not take the offer to go on house arrest.
Eu quero sair daqui com 100% da minha inocência. Não diga assim, vamos tirar o coitadinho que ele tá velho. Não tô velho. Vamos tirar o coitadinho porque vamos deixar ele em casa. Em casa vamos deixar ele, fica um velhinho lá em casa, pode até tomar um whiskyzinho dele, mas ele não vai receber gente controlada, não vai poder dar entrevista. Vamos colocar uma tornozeleira nele. Não sou pombo. Coloque neles a tornozeleira. Então eu só saio daqui. Eu sei que é duro para minhas pessoas, eu dizer isso para minhas netas, para meus filhos, mas só saio daqui com 100% de inocência. E maior prazer seria sair daqui o Moro entrar no meu lugar. Ele e o Dallagnol. Porque quem recebe dinheiro do Estado, quem presta um concurso, quem está para servir a sociedade e faz a canalice, a bandidagem que eles fizeram, eles não merecem estar soltos. Agora, eu espero que a Suprema Corte, no momento, tomada da sabedoria, sabe, de tanto estudo que as pessoas tiveram, lendo a Constituição, as pessoas façam um julgamento justo. Eu só quero isso. Só quero isso. Não se preocupem comigo aqui, que o coitadinho está sofrendo, não. Para mim é o seguinte, sair daqui, sem a minha inocência, é fazer como alguns, sair como um rato. Sabe? E eu não nasci para isso. Não nasci para isso. Eu prefiro estar aqui, de cabeça erguida, do que estar lá fora como um verme.
Guy is amazing. I'm sorry. I mean, like, I unembarrassedly stan. The guy is amazing. He also said in that interview, he said that he said they should be ready because if I do leave, I'm going to go on the streets and have a conversation with the Brazilian people. And then he also had this other amazing line, which we got to play at one point, where he said, he basically was saying almost that he regretted his work in Congress to make sure that Brazil couldn't proliferate a nuclear weapon. And he said, the only way Americans respect you is if you had a nuke. And he goes, that little Korean guy, they respect him. And then he said, I'm going to get out of here, get his haircut, build a nuke, and then maybe the white people respect Brazil. Well, he laughed. It was pretty funny. I'd recommend everybody watch all of that interview because we played the stuff about the BRICS, but he really gets into counter-hegemonic project, Latin America, and it's, you know, it's conducted by leftists, so much different content. We have Mark Zuckerberg stuff to get to in the postgame. We have a debunk based off of Ben Burgess and I's new article in Venezuela. We have some great words of encouragement and insight from the indispensable Adolph Reed. We're going to do an update on Haiti. We have a ton of stuff to get to, and the only way you can join us to do it is becoming a patron. So do that right now. Don't waste time. Patreon.com/TMBS. If you're having any problems, go check out your info. Make sure everything is up to date. Snag your tickets. We tweeted it out. There should be a link to it in the show notes as well, to the Philadelphia Live Show with Crystal Ball, Artesia Balthrop, and Emma Vigland, November 23rd. We will see you in the postgame. Thanks, everybody.